Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, and today we're diving into a topic that touches all of us: the psychology of friendships in our digital world. We often talk about how technology is changing our relationships, but rarely do we examine the deeper psychological mechanisms at play. How is the emotional labor of friendship changing? What happens when the inconvenient parts of relationships, the effort, vulnerability, and reciprocity, are stripped away by the ease of digital platforms? And most importantly, are our offline relationship patterns simply manifesting in new ways online, or is something fundamentally different happening? Let's explore how the digital age is transforming our friendships, for better and for worse. Friendship has always been a cornerstone of human experience, but what makes a true friend? Psychologically speaking, authentic friendships involve reciprocity, vulnerability, and what researchers call friendship work, the emotional labor required to maintain and nurture relationships. Traditionally, this labor was unavoidable. You remembered birthdays, showed up during difficult times, navigated conflicts face to face, and made time for each other despite busy schedules, marriages, children, school. These small inconveniences and efforts weren't just obstacles to overcome, they were the very substance that strengthened your bonds. Digital platforms have dramatically altered this dynamic. As Dr. Jeffrey Hall's research shows, close friendships typically require around 200 hours of meaningful interaction to develop. Social media shortcuts this process, offering a seemingly efficient alternative: likes instead of phone calls, comments instead of coffee dates, notifications instead of having to remember important events. But here's the psychological paradox: when we remove the work of friendship, we often remove its depth. The effort itself creates the intimacy of a friendship. It's what we call the IKEA effect, where we value things more when we've invested effort in creating them. This applies to relationships too. When friendships become effortless, they can become emotionally weightless. Importantly, this isn't solely about technology. Our offline patterns of attachment, our comfort with intimacy, and our willingness to be vulnerable all travel with us into our digital spaces. So, if we struggle with deep connections offline, social media just amplifies these tendencies rather than causes them. The platforms don't create our relationship patterns, they reveal them, and sometimes they magnify them. For years, Dunbar's number, the idea that humans can maintain only about 150 stable relationships, has been treated as gospel in discussions about social capacity. But recent research reveals this concept is far more complex than previously thought. The notion of a fixed cognitive limit is giving way to what psychologists call a social homeostasis model. Our capacity for connection isn't just about brain size or cognition, but about emotional bandwidth and psychological resources. Some individuals maintain fewer but deeper relationships, while others cultivate broader networks with varying levels of intimacy. What's fascinating is how this homeostasis plays out in digital spaces. Social media doesn't necessarily increase our capacity for meaningful connection. Rather, it shifts how we allocate our finite emotional resources. When we spread our attention across hundreds of connections, we're making unconscious decisions about our emotional investment. The psychological concept of the social attention economy helps explain this phenomenon. We all have limited attentional resources, and every scroll, like, and comment represents an investment choice. With each interaction, we're unconsciously asking, is this relationship worth the psychological energy it requires? Digital platforms don't increase our emotional bandwidth, but they do allow us to distribute it differently. The result is often a fundamental reshuffling of our relationship priorities, sometimes even without our conscious awareness. Facebook's evolution from a hot or not college co-ed ranking for Mark Zuckerberg to a college connection platform to a global social network has profoundly impacted how we conceptualize friendship psychologically. The platform encourages what sociologists call social collecting, accumulating connections as social capital rather than cultivating them as emotional resources. What's happening psychologically is particularly interesting. The platform triggers what researchers call social comparison theory, where we constantly evaluate ourselves against others, often unconsciously. But on Facebook, these comparisons occur in an environment deliberately designed to showcase life's highlights rather than life's authentic experiences. This creates a psychological environment where we're comparing our full reality, including all of our struggles and our ordinary moments and our unkindnesses as well as our kindnesses, against carefully curated presentations of others' lives. The resulting emotional dissonance can trigger what researchers call impression discrepancy, where we feel our actual self doesn't match the ideal self we present online. Not only that, Facebook's structure fundamentally alters what we call friendship maintenance behaviors. In traditional friendships, maintenance often requires proactive care, checking in, making plans, just showing up. But Facebook's passive consumption model transforms this into reactive engagement, responding to what appears in our feeds rather than actively reaching out. We can see evidence of this impact on our real life friendships in the decline of spontaneous phone calls, non holiday letter writing, and texting people just because or just to check in. This shift from proactive to reactive friendship maintenance represents a fundamental change in the psychological dynamic of our relationships, and crucially, those who struggle with proactive friendship behaviors offline often find Facebook's reactive model particularly appealing. It allows them to maintain a sense of connection without confronting their deeper patterns of avoidance or insecurity in relationships. TikTok offers a fascinating psychological contrast to Facebook's approach to connection. While both are platforms with massive reach, TikTok activates what psychologists call emotional contagion through its video-centric format. When we see someone's genuine emotion, laughter, tears, excitement, mirror neurons in our brains activate, creating a physiological response that can mimic what we're watching. This neurological mirroring creates what researchers call virtual co-presence, the feeling of being emotionally present with another person, despite physical separation. It's why watching a creator's spontaneous reaction can feel more authentic than reading a carefully crafted Facebook post. TikTok's format also leverages the psychological concept of self-disclosure reciprocity. When creators share vulnerable aspects of themselves, their struggles, insecurities, or their genuine joy, viewers experience a neurochemical response, similar to when a friend confides in them. This triggers our innate tendency to reciprocate openness, often leading viewers to share their own experiences in comments or create response videos. What makes these parasocial relationships psychologically powerful is that they activate many of the same neural pathways as traditional friendships. The brain's reward centers release dopamine during these interactions, reinforcing the sense of connection, even though it's one-sided. However, there's an important psychological distinction. While these connections stimulate similar neural pathways as traditional friendships, they lack what attachment theorists call secure base functions, the knowledge that someone will be consistently available in times of need or a cornerstone of secure attachment. This explains why many people simultaneously report feeling deeply connected to content creators while still experiencing loneliness. The parasocial relationships provide emotional stimulation, but not the psychological security of a reciprocal friendship. Different social platforms create distinct psychological environments that shape how we form and maintain connections. The design of these digital spaces isn't neutral. Each activates different aspects of our relationship psychology. Snapchat, with its ephemeral content, taps into what psychologists call the intimacy of transience. When content disappears, it creates a psychological space that feels more like an in person conversation, here now, gone later, reducing self consciousness and increasing authentic sharing. This ephemeral quality activates the scarcity principle in psychology, where we value what we can't permanently access, often making Snapchat interactions feel more precious. Instagram, conversely, creates what researchers call a performance stage, where identity presentation is carefully managed. This triggers the psychological phenomenon of identity labor, the work of constructing and maintaining a particular self image. The platform's design encourages what social psychologists call impression management, where we present idealized versions of ourselves, often at the cost of authentic connection. Discord and Slack represent yet another psychological model, creating what community psychologists call psychological neighborhoods, spaces built around shared interests rather than geographic proximity or existing relationships. These internet based communities activate the powerful psychological mechanism of identity fusion, where group membership becomes integrated into personal identity, creating strong bonds that sometimes rival traditional friendships. These different psychological environments explain why many of us behave differently across platforms. We're all responding to distinct social cues and relationship frameworks on each social network. Our offline relationship patterns interact with these environments, sometimes amplifying our tendencies and sometimes creating space to develop a new way of connecting. The fundamental psychological trade off in digital friendships involves what researchers call relational bandwidth. While social media expands the number of connections we can maintain, it often compresses the depth of each interaction. This creates what psychologists term affective forecasting errors. We predict that maintaining more connections will increase our sense of belonging, but we often discover that quantity doesn't translate to emotional satisfaction. Research shows that our psychological well being correlates more strongly with having a few close confidants than with maintaining a large network of acquaintances. Digital platforms can trigger what attachment theorists call anxious attachment behaviors, constantly checking for responses, seeking validation through likes or comments, and feeling insecure when engagement is low. These behaviors stem from fundamental attachment patterns formed in early relationships that find new expression in digital spaces. The concept of psychological presence is particularly relevant here. Meaningful relationships require what psychologists call attentional investment, the willingness to be fully present with another person. Digital platforms designed to capture and fragment attention often undermine this capacity for presence. We may be responding to a friend's significant life event while simultaneously scrolling through other content, diminishing the psychological impact of the interaction. Perhaps most importantly, social media creates what we call cumulative absences, small but seemingly insignificant moments of distraction that compound over time. Each instance where a phone interrupts an in person conversation might seem minor, but collectively they can erode relationship quality through what we call attentional erosion. These trade offs aren't inevitable consequences of technology, but they rather emerge from how we individually and collectively use these tools. Our offline patterns of avoidance, attachment, and attention all influence how we navigate our digital spaces. Framing the concept we're discussing through the lens of personal stories can illuminate these psychological principles in action. Consider a woman who maintains a group chat with college friends scattered across the country. The chat provides continuous connection, but she notices that conversations remain surface level until they institute monthly video calls where deeper sharing can occur. This illustrates what we call disclosure thresholds, the conditions necessary for vulnerability to emerge in relationships. Or take, for example, a man who develops a supportive community through an online mental health forum. The anonymity of the platform creates what we call a disinhibition effect, allowing him to share struggles he conceals from his in-person friends. This demonstrates the stranger on the train phenomenon. Sometimes we find it easier to be vulnerable with those we don't see daily because there's less perceived risk to our established identities. We could also think about the woman who finds herself exhausted by maintaining her Instagram persona while feeling increasingly disconnected from her followers. She's experiencing what we call identity labor fatigue, the psychological toll of presenting a curated self. If she begins sharing more authentic content, engagement initially drops, but the quality of interactions improves, demonstrating the psychological principle that authenticity often deepens connection, even if it narrows your audience. These narratives highlight that digital friendships aren't inherently shallow or deep. Rather, they reflect our psychological choices about vulnerability, authenticity, and attention. The technology provides the medium, but we bring our psychological patterns to the spaces. Psychological research offers valuable insights into nurturing meaningful connections in digital spaces. And while I have adopted the habit of putting the bulk of the research in the show notes, I did want to call out a few researchers' work here. For example, Dr. Sherry Turkle's work on reclaiming conversation emphasizes that digital tools work best as bridges between in-person interactions rather than replacements for them. Her research shows that the absence of nonverbal cues in digital communication can reduce empathy by up to 40% compared to in-person interactions. I think we've all seen this happen in comment sections. Dr. John Cacioppo's research on loneliness reveals that the quality of social interactions matters more than the quantity. His work finds that subjective feelings of isolation can persist despite numerous digital connections, highlighting what psychologists call the intimacy paradox, being increasingly connected yet feeling increasingly alone. Attachment theorist Dr. Sue Johnson points out that secure attachment requires emotional accessibility and responsiveness, qualities that can be difficult to convey through text-based communication. Her research suggests using video communication more frequently, as facial expressions and voice tone activate attachment systems more effectively than text. Social psychologist Dr. Jonathan Haidt emphasizes the importance of what he calls structured disconnection, intentional periods away from digital platforms to rebuild attentional capacity. His research showed that even brief digital sabbaticals can significantly improve relationship satisfaction by restoring what neuroscientists call present moment awareness. What emerges from this collective research is a nuanced understanding that digital tools can either enhance or diminish quality depending on how they're used. The key psychological factor isn't the technology itself, but whether it facilitates or hinders authentic self-disclosure, additional presence, and emotional responsiveness, the cornerstones of meaningful connection. Research-backed strategies can help us navigate the psychological complexities of digital friendships. Dr. Hall's friendship studies suggest implementing what he calls the 40-20-10 rule. He suggests spending 40 minutes in face-to-face or voice conversation with close friends weekly, sending 20-minute voice messages to maintain mid-tier friendships, and using 10-minute text check-ins for casual connections. This tiered approach helps allocate emotional resources according to relationship significance. If you're not a phone call person, you can flip those numbers around, but the ratio remains pretty solid. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability suggests practicing what she calls digital courage, being willing to share authentic struggles rather than only the highlights, which her studies show increases relationship depth. She recommends starting with controlled vulnerability, sharing challenges you've already processed rather than raw emotions to help you build comfort with authenticity online. Communication researchers recommend addressing what they call channel expansion, using multiple forms of communication with important relationships. Their studies show that relationships maintained across diverse channels, text, voice, video, in person, demonstrate greater resilience than those confined to a single medium. Mindfulness researchers suggest practicing what they call social media intention setting, taking a moment before opening platforms to clarify your purpose. Their studies show this simple practice reduces passive consumption and increases meaningful engagement by activating the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for intentional behavior. And finally, relationship psychologists recommend regular digital relationship audits, evaluating whether your online interactions are enhancing or diminishing your sense of connection. Research shows that this conscious evaluation helps align digital behavior with relationship values, sometimes leading to significant changes in platform usage. These strategies aren't about rejecting digital connection, but rather about bringing psychological intentionality to these spaces, ensuring that technology serves our relationship needs rather than reshaping those needs to fit technological limitations. It's clear that while digital platforms have transformed how we connect, the psychological foundations of meaningful friendships remain remarkably consistent: attentional presence, vulnerability, reciprocity, and what we call bids for connection, those small moments of reaching out that build relationships over time. The digital age hasn't fundamentally changed what we need from our friendships, but it has changed how we pursue those needs. The most psychologically healthy approach isn't to reject these new tools, nor to embrace them uncritically, but to use them with intention, recognizing that they amplify our existing tendencies while creating opportunities to develop new relational skills. Perhaps most importantly, we should remember that our digital behaviors don't exist in isolation from our offline patterns. The person who struggles with vulnerability in face-to-face relationship will likely struggle online with this as well. The friend who makes time for others, despite a busy schedule, will likely maintain that priority in her digital spaces as well. In the end, meaningful connection, whether digital or in person, requires what we call relational mindfulness, the conscious decision to be present with another person, to risk vulnerability, and to engage in the sometimes inconvenient but ultimately rewarding work of friendship. Thank you for tuning in to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. And until next time, stay connected and stay curious. Bit of housekeeping before we sign off for the day. I have been nominated for a Women in Podcasting Award, and there'll be a link to vote for that in the show notes. We also have a Patreon. There will be a link to that in the show notes. And we're getting more and more community there, which I love. That's how you can talk to me about the episodes or on our social media. If you're not a subscriber yet, if this is your first time listening, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a week. Thank you. See you next time.